Welcome to the Survivor's Guide to Thriving podcast, the show for people who are ready to break out of survival mode in order to build a truly thriving life. I'm Amanda Solman, and along with Mark Jewell, my co-host and the founder and CEO of Mark Jewell Speaking and Training, we break down common roadblocks that keep people stuck surviving and share ideas to help you thrive each and every day. This week on the podcast, Wade is joining me to talk about those subjects where we just need to agree to disagree. Whether you find yourself triggered by politics, religion, the right and wrong way to parent your kids, we're going to talk about ways that you can have those conversations in a more productive, more positive manner. So, check it out. So, Wade, today we're going to talk about how to have conversations in situations where you just sometimes have to agree to disagree. Tell me a little bit about what some of your initial thoughts are on that idea. I know you've been working with some coaching clients who are struggling with this, so I'm just curious, how has this idea shown up for you?
Yeah, I'd like to start with a quote. Just in preparing for this podcast recording, Amanda, I found this Thomas Jefferson quote that I just love. And he said, "I never considered a difference of opinion in politics, in religion, in philosophy as cause for withdrawing from a friend." And I think that's beautifully stated, and just it really summarizes what we're doing here. So, maybe there's another right answer besides either these are subjects we can talk about, these are subjects we can't talk about. Maybe there's some middle ground that we can find.
I'm convinced that there is a Thomas Jefferson quote for just about everything. But all joking aside, I mean, the man has a point. We shouldn't let a difference of opinion or a disagreement be the thing that tears relationships apart, whether those are, work relationships, friendships, romantic relationships, whatever. But the reality is, I think we see all too often that these things do drive a wedge between people, and there has to be a better way to deal with it. So, Wade, in the Jefferson quote you used there, one of the very first things that came up, and I think is something that all of our clients usually think of, I think pretty much anybody could think of this as one of the biggest topics where people have a hard time agreeing to disagree, is around politics. So share with me some of your initial thoughts on how that topic in particular can come between people, and then we'll add on to it, because I think there's some other topics that are similar, but I know politics really is top of mind for a lot of people when it comes to this subject.
So, starting off with the politics one, I guess one thing I just want to make sure people understand is that when the founding fathers, formed this government, they were able to talk through stuff. And really, up until I think it's about the middle of the 20th century, they were able to talk through things. But a lot of it has to do with the political parties and just alignment around those subjects, whichever side you're on. But it hasn't always been the case. And I read the Thomas Jefferson biography. I can't remember which one it was, but he said something to the effect of, if I have to align myself with a political party to enter heaven's gates, I'll be waiting outside. And I thought that also, I promise these aren't all Thomas Jefferson quotes here today, but I thought that was very well stated as well. Just, when you consider something like politics, is there any politician you align 100% with? I can't think of any for myself. And just recognizing the fact that, everybody has their own opinion. Everybody's at a different point on their path, and that's okay. So the old saying of, seek first to understand, then to be understood, I think that definitely applies with all of these subjects.
It definitely does. So let's talk about a few of those other subjects that came up. For example, some people said that, it's hard to agree to disagree on things like religion, on things like parenting techniques. Somebody mentioned, the right and wrong way to sell, or another person even said, in agriculture, which is the industry that we work a lot in, that it can be hard to agree to disagree on, the quote unquote right way to farm and raise food, or to, be a steward of the environment. Like, these are all hot button topics that there's a lot of opinions and a lot of people impacted on all sides of them. So what are some of your thoughts on some of those other issues? I mean, I think we all know politics is a given, but this topic of agreeing to disagree can come up in a lot of other areas as well.
Parenting approaches. I know with a couple of our coaching clients, when a couple separates or gets divorced, oftentimes that's a situation where we have different styles, and it's one of the triggers that sets us off about the other person, is how they're parenting your kids. And it comes back to focus on what you can control the controllable, and, do what you're doing and let that person do what they're doing. As long as, it's not endangering anybody, you're wasting your energy stressing over something that somebody else is doing. Other things, such as selling techniques, I know for me personally, there was a point in my career where I was just in the wrong culture. And you got to find the culture that aligns with who you want to be and what you want to do. But the last thing I'll say is just on the subject of religion, for me, and it's our own personal story, right? But Nicole and I grew up different religions. And so when we got married, for about the first 10 years, every other Sunday, we'd go to the other church. And at first, I went into it, just like what we're going to be talking about here, trying to win the fight and win the argument. And it wasn't until I backed off and just allowed some space that she felt comfortable to discuss. And then, when we finally started to open up and talk about it, then we figured out what we wanted as parents for our kids and the legacy that we wanted to leave. And, when I stopped pressing, that's when we were able to have a better conversation and figure out what is the right solution for us. So I know for me personally, that was something that really was a big deal for me and for our family.
Wade, I appreciate you sharing that story. I think it just highlights the fact that all of us deal with these hot button issues in our lives in some way, shape, or form. And so we have to take the time to really figure out how to work through them, because otherwise, it can just be really hard on us in a lot of different ways. So where we want to go next is looking at questions to consider, questions to ask yourself when you're in a situation where you're having a disagreement or a difference of opinion with someone. You might hear us refer to these during the conversation as our rules of engagement. But they're really just things to keep in mind that might help you work through those situations a little easier. So the first thing that I want to highlight is the idea of it is really important to understand why you are engaging or considering engaging in this hot button conversation. Wade, you mentioned this earlier, but one of the things that I keep coming back to is I think that far too often we engage in these combative conversations purely because we want to win the argument. I think that's something to watch out for, especially if you are someone who has persuasiveness as one of your strengths. When that goes into overdrive, you may find yourself arguing just for the sake of arguing.
All right. So I'm guilty of that one. I do have persuasiveness as a strength, and I know you knew that. But for the audience, that is one of my strengths. And when Nicole was reading through my Strength Scope report and she saw that one and what it looked like in overdrive, she's like, yep, that's you. And I'm like, wait, what do you mean by that? And her example was perfect. And she said, we go to a party and you argue over some moot point for hours. And, I didn't realize I was doing that. But, when you're in your strength, you're so fired up about it, feels so good. it's tough to let go. But that is a perfect example. Absolutely, Amanda.
But I think we're all susceptible to doing this. It brings to mind something I read in a book that I'm reading right now called The Four Agreements, where the author said, quote, "Your opinion is nothing but your point of view. It's not necessarily true. Your opinion comes from your beliefs, from your own ego, and from your own dream," which the author in this case is what the term he uses for how you see the world. And then he goes on to say, "We all create this poison and we spread it to others just so we can feel right about our own point of view." And I know I've done this probably far too many times that I'd like to count. But I do think that's one of the reasons we get ourselves into trouble is when we think about, well, why am I engaging in this conversation? It's because, you know what? I want to win. I want to prove that I am right. And so, Wade, I'm curious, thoughts on that?
Yeah, along with the beliefs and your own ego, letting go of pride. I think that's a big part of it. I was working with someone here in the last few days about this exact subject. And, he had gotten in an argument with someone that he loved. And instead of talking through it or recognizing, okay, let's take a break, they kept going and then hung up on each other for a few days before they sat back down and actually talked about it. And when I asked him, I said, so, when you were in the moment, what were you wanting? He's like, I wanted to win. And when you win, that means somebody else loses. And if this person is a loved one or just a friend or an acquaintance or somebody that you want to do business with, you can't have the mindset of going in wanting to win. You have to think, okay, long term, what do I want in this relationship? Focus on that. And that should let go of the instinct to go for the throat.
I think that's really right. And I mean, there's even situations where, where you have a good relationship with someone and you're willing to give them the benefit of the doubt on the things you disagree on because you know what the bigger picture is, because that relationship is more important than any disagreement you might have. So I think that is a really good point. So, we've kind of hammered this home. It's important to understand why you're engaging in these conversations. It really needs to not be from a place of winning, but rather a place of, I want to engage in this maybe to learn more about the other person. Maybe it's in order to really understand their point of view, or maybe it's, this is why I'm not engaging in the conversation, which is because it's not important or because I know that, if we fight about this, it'll hurt the relationship. So that why becomes a really important piece of the puzzle. And if you don't figure that out first, it makes some of these other questions that we're going to talk about a little bit more challenging. So always start with, why am I engaging or not engaging in this conversation? And if it seems very ego driven, very selfish, then maybe it's time to take a step back and reevaluate the situation. Once you've had a chance to sort of think about why you're having this engagement, the next question you get to ask is, how am I showing up to this conversation? Now, some things to keep in mind when it comes to how you're showing up are things like tone of voice, things like your body language, right? Are you open and listening, or are you on the defense? Another thing that falls under this umbrella of how do I come to the conversation is the time and place in which the conversation takes place. Sometimes it's not the right time and place, but you could have that conversation in another environment that would be more conducive to it. Wade, I know you have an example specifically around time and place. Do you want to go ahead and share that with us?
I started out in a family business, and being in family business, that means all the lines are crossed. There's work flows into personal flows into work. Grandma's watching the grandkids. It's everything, right? And one thing that it took me some time to figure out, but we needed to agree that family gatherings and holidays, the family business is off limits. We could talk about it tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock or Monday morning at 8, but we're not going to talk about it here. And when we agreed to do that, then we avoided those uncomfortable situations where, you take a Thanksgiving dinner and all of a sudden it becomes uncomfortable. So just recognizing and agreeing to what are the terms, when and where is it appropriate to have each of these discussions.
I think that's a really good example of how to be purposeful about how you have these hot button conversations. You chose to put some parameters around when and where those happen. And all of that goes back to, again, understanding why you're having the conversation in the first place. Now, sometimes it is going to be important to have those conversations, but you can be purposeful about your tone. You can be purposeful about your body language. You can be purposeful about when and where you have the conversation when you're clear on the why. So Wade, I appreciate you sharing that. I think that's a really good example.
Yeah, and keep in mind, it took me about 15 years to figure that one out. To be able to say, look, time out. We're going to take a break. We'll pick it up next time. And I guess I shouldn't say that. There was a point when I was working with farmers, and maybe we were out for golf league one night, and somebody wants to talk about what's the price of corn going to do. And I'm not there to talk about that. And, just saying, all right, I'd be happy to set up a time tomorrow. But oftentimes it's just one of those situations where they don't know what else to talk with you about. And so that's when they bring up those subjects that really it's not the right time or the right place.
Absolutely. And I think that's actually a really good example of a concept that we teach around here a lot, which, listeners of this podcast have probably heard, which is you train others how to treat you. And so if you don't want to be in those situations where you're getting drug into conversations about politics, conversations about religion, you get to take back some control of that situation and set some clear boundaries for yourself. I also think it's a good way to you say, you know what, we're here to have fun. Let's save the controversial stuff for, when we're on business time or when we're in a better time and place. So for sure, something to think about. The next rule of engagement I want to take a look at, or self-reflection question, you might call it, is, am I here with the intention to listen to receive information, or am I purely here listening to respond? I think we know we can all get in trouble when, we're sort of hearing what the other person is saying, but what we're actually doing is just creating our response in our head, or what we're preparing for what we're going to say next, versus, really listening to receive the information that the other person is saying in order to really process it and consider it.
Whenever you're in a situation where, neither side is listening, there's no point in really continuing that conversation at that point in time. It doesn't mean you can't come back to it later, but that's a really good sign to take a break.
Which I think does a really good job of setting up our next rule of engagement, which is know when to take a timeout, right? There may be points in time where you're not in a mindset to have this conversation. The other person isn't in a mindset to have this conversation. And you just need to step back and say, okay, time out. Let's take a break from what we're talking about.
Yeah, it starts with just recognizing where you're at personally and where the other person is at. Sometimes, you have two people who are both passionate about a certain topic. And, if we go in and we're so focused on winning and getting our points across and getting my next point across and my next one, it's not going to make a difference anyways. I think that's one reason why people shut down and don't talk about it. It wasn't always like that. We used to be able to talk about things and discuss things and go have a beer and talk about what we agree upon, instead of, well, I can't bring this up because that person, votes differently, so we can't even have a conversation about it. So I think we need to recognize where we're at, if we have the right mindset, and if not, agree to the terms of, okay, we're going to take a break. We will come back to this, but we're going to come back when we're in a setting, when we're, by ourselves and there's nothing else going on. and we're going to talk through, because I want to understand where you're coming from on this. It's important for me to understand, what's your background? When did you first start showing interest in the subject? And when you really seek to understand, then be understood, that's when you start to get breakthrough and you start to be able to talk about these subjects instead of just shutting down and, like you said, just taking the ball and going home with it.
Yeah, there were a couple of things in what you just said that I want to just reinforce in sort of the little sample conversation that you just walked through. And that was, one, you called the timeout verbally. Two, you reiterated that we're not done having this conversation. We will come back. And then three, you restated your why, right? I want to understand where you're coming from. I want to understand your point of view. I just don't know that we can have that conversation rationally right now. And so I kind of want to just call attention to those, because I think that's a really good way to structure that, let's call a timeout type conversation.
When you agree upon these rules of engagement, then this might apply to other things. So you might set this up when political subjects, when you come to blows on something like that, but then you apply it to other things in life. So, just understanding that, okay, if I feel like the other person is not hearing me, this is the process that we're going to engage in, then you have a productive outcome, or you have a much higher likelihood of a productive outcome.
Now, Wade, I know you and I are really talking about, how to have these conversations when you do want to have them, or in some cases when you need to have them. I think of situations when parents need to come to some sort of middle ground on how to raise their children in some cases. That's a conversation you have to have. But are there any conversations or any hot button topics that come to mind for you where you say, actually, we should just avoid this altogether? Maybe it's not even about agreeing to disagree. It's more about like, hey, let's just not talk about this because it really isn't that important.
When you think about a particular topic, it may not even matter. One thing that I quit doing several years ago was watching the 24-hour news cycle. When I unplugged from that, all of a sudden the stuff that everybody was talking about, I'm like, I really don't care about. And just, it's not that I don't care about that particular subject, but that particular topic within the subject, I'm not going to lose any sleep over, or I'm not going to raise my blood pressure over or get into arguments about. I know I've coached several people who've unplugged from that and are so much happier when they do. And, they don't realize how wrapped up in these topics they are until they step away. And if you're not sure about that, just, no news for the next week and just see how it goes. You might be amazed at how much different you feel going into each and every day.
I can definitely see how that might be the case. And I actually really like that idea of doing a little test run for yourself. I know for myself, there are times where I want to be in the know about certain things. And so I'm taking in some content, and I just have to kind of, gauge my mindset, gauge my energy, and how well I can handle that. And there are other times when I say, you know what, I will just be much better off without this information, and I can just, table it, and I'll learn the details if I need to later. But I like kind of doing that test run of, go a week without it and see what you find out. So the next rule of engagement I want to talk about is thinking about, am I coming to this conversation with assumptions? Am I coming with a picture in my head already of how this person is? Because the reality is, if I'm coming into this conversation with an assumption about how that person is or what they believe, again, going back to the earlier point, I'm not actually listening because I already think I know what they're going to say.
I know we've said this several times, but when I assume, I lose. And when I label somebody, I am making a big assumption that may or may not be right. And when I do that, I'm going to lose. And so, maybe it's the job that they have, or the part of the country they grew up in, or their family structure, or whatever that is. Taking time to get to know the individual and ask questions out of curiosity instead of seeking to identify, do they align with what I think, or, but just take time to ask better questions out of curiosity. I think is a big point in recognizing the value of that individual person.
Absolutely. And I think this one even goes back to, the old golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, or, something along those lines. And that is, you don't want people to make assumptions or make snap judgments about you just based on a few like high level things they think they know about you. You want to be treated as an individual with opinions that are of your own. And so we should show that same respect to the people that we're engaging in conversation with.
Absolutely. Yeah. We've talked about Nick Doyle and the kickboxing here in Omaha. I was looking at his website one time, and his motto at the bottom just really spoke to me. And I'm going to paraphrase it here, but everyone I meet is my teacher. And so when you think about that, for the leader of a kickboxing gym, to have that as his mantra, that's really cool. Just seeing the value in every individual, instead of labeling them as, oh, this person can help me, this person can't. I think that's actually a really good thing to consider, in anything that you do in life. Do you consider the value of the person at the checkout counter? Do you consider the value of the person who's opening the door at the hotel? There's a lot of things that we overlook, and every single person is just that, is a person. So taking time to learn about them and where they're at on their path.
And one of the things that you can do while you're trying to learn about that other person is to really pay attention to what you're doing to show that you're listening, that you're hearing, that you're comprehending. It kind of goes back to the old adage, right? You have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. And I think in some conversations, you would think that goes the opposite direction. But when we listen more than we speak, and when we do those, nonverbal or small cues to demonstrate that we're listening, that can make the other person feel really important.
I remember a story about two people who were running for prime minister in Britain. And a reporter had the opportunity to go out for dinner with each of these two candidates. And, the first person had this really dynamic discussion, and it was, just all his points were in order and just made a lot of sense. And then the other person went completely differently. And when asked afterwards what he thought, he said, the first person, it was very apparent that he was the most important person. The second person made me feel like I was the most important person. And recognizing that, how much talking are we doing and how much listening? And actually, for people, whether they're in sales or leadership positions, when somebody says something, acknowledging that, and maybe repeating that before we start to tell them, what's on our minds, but just how we process that information and how we reflect back to them, that it's been heard. Man, that is a totally different experience when you're on a sales call or in a business meeting.
Wade, one of the final rules of engagement or self-reflection things that I want to bring to the forefront here and offer to everybody is to always remember that how we view any specific topic comes from our own story, our own hardwiring, our own lifetime of experiences, of the environment we grew up in, what we have seen around us our entire lives. And so some of us will be more or less comfortable with any number of situations or conversation topics. So it's important to remember that, your story is different than everyone else's story. So we have to take that into account and be considerate of the fact that we don't all view the world through the same pair of glasses, right? And, in some cases that is a really awesome thing. And in other cases, it does cause conflict. But it is a reality that we have to keep in mind. So whenever you are struggling with, why can't I get that person to just get on board with what I have to say or with my opinion, remember, they have a whole different background than you. They see the world in a very different way, and we have to be respectful of that.
Somebody used this example with me a few years ago, but they said if and they used the political parties as an example. But if you're on this side, then you're going to listen to this station on the radio, and if you're on this side, you're going to listen to this station on the radio, or listen to this TV station, and they're going to be talking about the same topic, but you're going to hear it through a different lens. And when you consider that, just be careful what filters you are taking information through, and then understand that the other person may not have a filter that they're looking at things through, and that's okay. But just asking questions to learn about the individual, and when did you first start showing interest, and those kinds of questions. Even if you get to the end and you realize that it's okay to disagree, that's fine, but there's going to be an appreciation that you're able to talk through this instead of just shutting down and going home.
And two, once we start to recognize that because we all have a different story, because we all have a different experience, that there are a lot of dynamics at play, right? We don't just come up with our opinions because we're right and the other person is dumb, right? There's all sorts of dynamics at play here that we have to start paying attention to, but we can't come to that conclusion until we realize that there is a reason for every viewpoint. There's a reason for every opinion. There's a background for how that person got to the conclusion that they did, the same as, there's a reason you came to the conclusion that you did.
We look at these topics as being black and white, that it's very clear distinction of what's right and what's wrong. But if you gain a different perspective, you see there's a whole lot more gray, and there's very, very rarely ever black and white. And so, that's something that, whether it's listening to YouTube or podcasts from multiple different sources, having personal conversations, but the more you get out and talk with other people, the more you realize it's very, very rarely ever black and white. That's one of the reasons why, people say, you need to travel. You need to get out and see the world. And because when you get out and you see how people live and you start to understand, there's more to this than simply, there's no work ethic, or there's, they're lazy or something like that. There's more to it. And so get out and get different perspectives, or read about different perspectives. But when you start to open up to that, you'll gain much greater appreciation for other people's perspectives and their story.
For sure. Wade, as we bring this in for a landing, I had one more thought come to mind that I want to make sure we address. And I should have thought of this back when we were talking about, the best time and place to have some of these hot button controversial conversations. And I know you mentioned, really physical time and place, right? Like, we're not going to have these conversations at the dinner table. We're not going to have these conversations on the holidays. But one of the other things that I want to make sure to call out is that very often these conversations get put out broad spectrum on social media. And I would really challenge folks to consider whether that is the right time and place to have that conversation, whether it's the right format, whether you even really know that person or care about that person in a way that there's value in engaging. Sometimes your Facebook page, sometimes it's better to just keep scrolling. It's not worth it to engage. And so I just wanted to add that in there, that social media counts under the heading of, is this the right time and place to have this conversation?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things that get thrown around on social media that it's just not the right place, and it's not that it's subjects that shouldn't be discussed, but, like you said, somebody throws out this big controversial thing and very one-sided viewpoint. And then when tempers flare and people fire back, then all of a sudden like, whoa. And, come on, let's think about this before we hit send and consider, is this the right forum? Is this the right medium to use this particular viewpoint, to share this viewpoint?
Very good. So, Wade, do you have any final thoughts on the topic of agreeing to disagree that you want to make sure we cover?
Coming at these discussions from a place of love and respect versus I'm going to exploit somebody's weakness or, the fact that they're not up to date on this particular topic. Sometimes these subjects are brought up, sometimes it's passive aggressively, sometimes it's, I know this is that other person's trigger. And when it's done that way, guess what? Those subjects are soon going to become out of bounds.
That they will. Thank you, Wade, for coming on the show this week to have what I thought was a pretty uncontroversial conversation about how to handle controversial conversations. Thanks again.
Thank you, Amanda. I appreciate the fact that we can talk through this stuff and hopefully give some people some better perspectives on how to handle these types of things in their own lives, whether they're at work or at home. Let's find a way to figure out, where everybody's coming from, and then how do we want to view these topics or discuss these topics moving forward, and make it mutually agreeable instead of one side wins, one side loses type of thing.
Thanks again to Wade for joining us on the pod this week. To connect with him further, just look for Wade Johannes on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Snapchat. If you like what you heard, make sure to jump over to Apple Podcasts and leave us a rating and review. We appreciate the feedback, and it also helps other people find the show. As always, if you're looking for more resources to go from surviving to thriving, check out our website at www.markjeweltraining.com. That's Jewel with 2 L's. And you can find us under Mark Jewel Speaking and Training on all the major social networks. Remember, survival is dead. It's your time to thrive today. See you next week.